Puff Daddy?
Your friend Kyle told me you don't understand the importance of voting.
In Lucky Paper's Zendikar Rising Cube survey.
Apparently you haven't heard of my Vote or Die campaign.
Vote or die? What the hell does that even mean?
What you think it means.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here with my buddy 10 Draft Anthony. Anthony, we've been playing so much Cube. Like, since we last recorded, how many drafts have we done? How many drafts have you done?
I have no idea.
It's at least 4, because you and I have done 4 together, I think.
Do you count just like jamming sim drafts back to back on Cube Cobra?
Oh, if we count those, it's going to be some real scary numbers. I don't think we can count those for our own health and well-being. Those don't count as drafts. I mean, like, cubes you drafted with human beings, and then you played the games. We've done a lot in the last week.
We've been doing a lot. And observing even more.
Because I was plumbing my memory for a nickname for you, and I was like, well, this week Anthony cast 6 Uros in one game, so I could call him Anthony 6 Uro Maddox. We've been playing a new cube of your own design, which we're going to be talking about this week on the show. We played that twice in full draft since we last spoke to each other. So there's been a lot going on.
Oh, I did even more. I did a couple, just 2-player drafts of that, so...
So are you happy to be playing a lot of Cube, Anthony? Does it bring you joy?
It's mixed.
Yeah, I wish it could be in paper. I think is the only caveat.
Yeah.
You know, it's a lot of staring at a screen, but
a lot of little rectangles in my eyes. I feel like I'm getting screen burn.
Everything is screen now. That is all there is. Anyway, like I said, this week on the show, we're going to be talking about a new cube Anthony has designed and built, actually based on a direct conversation we had last week on the show, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But first, Anthony, we're going to do our Pack 1 Pick 1, and we are changing our approach to the Pack 1 Pick 1 a little bit. We have been feeling already like it was kind of dragging on a little bit and a lot of reading cards, which is kind of annoying. And then we got feedback from a couple of listeners out there that it's just really hard to follow and kind of long. And one person even just asked me like, hey, can you like post the time code for when you're done with the Pack 1 Pick 1 so I can just skip right to there every time?
That's feedback.
So yeah, we appreciate the feedback, and we are hearing you. And so I think instead of us reading, the entire pack, which is ultimately 14 cards we don't care about and one we do, or maybe a couple we care about that are competing for it, Anthony and I have both just looked at the pack ahead of time and are going to basically, talk about the top contenders in the pack for us, and then we'll, do it that way. So we're still going to talk about some cards. It'll still, I think, perform the same function of allowing us to highlight a new environment and as a jumping off point for different conversations we might not otherwise think to have, but we are not just going to read every single card because that is getting a little bit tiresome. So we are looking at a pack from Anthony's brand new cube, which we will talk about after this conversation. And Anthony, there are 4 cards that are in the top cards of this pack for me, and those cards are Porcelain Legionnaire, which I like a lot, Phyrexian Metamorph, which I like a lot, Maze Mine Tome, which is a card that I'm pretty high on, I think, from M21, and Guild Globe. Guild Globe is my 4th card in the sort of top 4 for me. What are your top cards in this pack?
My top 4 are exactly the same. I think it's just a question of order, and then what sort of falls on after those.
Wow, we agree completely. So, order for me, my number 1 pick with a bullet, which I assume is also your number 1 pick, is just Guild Globe, right?
Absolutely. I mean, like, the thing about this format is it's just so extremely powerful and fast, and Guild Globe is just an insane magic card. It does everything you want it to do.
Yeah, so people that don't know what Guild Globe does, this is 2 mana for an artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and then it has pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to add 2 mana of any different colors to your mana pool. So it's kind of like a build your own egg, if you're familiar with the original eggs, from which the type of card eggs originates. So that's, pretty good, right? I think it's significantly better than Legionnaire and Metamorph and Maze Mine Tome. And there's some other stuff in this pack which is fine, like Krenko Tin Street Kingpin is fine. One of these fixing lands might be okay, but yeah, I'm definitely taking Guild Globe here.
So what are your next picks after Guild Globe between the other 3?
It's Tome for me is next, I think, pretty clearly. So Guild Globe is like, I think, head and shoulders above the pack, almost power, and then Maze Mine Tome is second.
And
is that
then,
the same for you?
Yes, same.
I can't decide between Legionnaire and Metamorph. I think Metamorph is actually probably the pick, but in a certain deck, like Legionnaire is actually a little more narrow here than I originally thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do agree, like, it really fits more just in the aggressive decks, and it is limiting because of that. Metamorph is obviously still very strong. I think between the two, I'm still on Legionnaire before Metamorph.
Yeah, it's close. It's really, really close.
Yeah. And then beyond that in this pack, we've got, I think next for me would be Krenko, and then we have some Shocklands and Wraths and some ramp effects, which are all pretty strong as well. But yeah, I think all these colorless effects are really head and shoulders above them.
Yeah, I would actually say that I think for me, the Shocklands are near the bottom of the pack, and the Wrath is quite high for me. The Wrath is probably my fifth pick, honestly. It's Shatter the Sky is the particular Wrath we're talking about. And I think Crashing Drawbridge might be in contention as well.
That's a good
believe
point.
It or not. So this has been a test of the Pack One Pick One system. If you're listening to this and paying any attention, then I hope you are wondering what the hell is going on. This makes no sense whatsoever. And if you didn't think that, then you got to listen closer to the Pack One Pick One, friends, because why on earth would Anthony and I ever consider taking Guild Globe, a perfectly serviceable but unexciting common, out of a pack that has Phyrexian Metamorph, Porcelain Legionnaire, Krenko, Tin Street Kingpin, 3 different Shocklands, and tell the people, Anthony, tell them why.
Well, in this case, we have a small rule. All spells and abilities cost 2 less to cast and activate.
Yeah, so this is Anthony's new, you're calling it the Turbo Cube, and that is the sort of stipulation. And the way you have it worded, right, is everyone starts with an emblem in play that they pay 2 less for all spells, 2 generic mana less for all spells, and 2 generic mana less for all activated abilities.
Exactly. So it's just like this was very much directly inspired by the Turbo Cube that was on Arena. And I think just like having an emblem rather than some other kind of like rules modification just states it pretty clearly in the same way that like Magic rules work. So if you're familiar with other cost reduction effects, it works in regular ways and you can figure it out.
Yeah, so we've played this cube quite a few times this week. You and I did 2 one-on-one drafts, which we played out. And then there was a draft we did with more people involved. And am I correct in assuming this is, I mean, obviously this is inspired by the Arena Turbo Cube, but also it seems like your creation of this cube seems like it stemmed directly from a conversation we had last week on the show where you basically said, like, you know, if people want to play with powerful cards, they can just, you know, make up rules and play with powerful cards. And that was why you talked about the Arena Cube. So what made you actually go through the trouble of putting 360 cards together into a cube to play this cube specifically?
That's 6 months of being isolated in a small apartment.
So you're losing your marbles, is what you're telling me.
They're not all there anymore. I'm losing my Guild Globes.
You gestured a novelty cube, like, look, could a depressed person possibly make this beautiful thing I've created?
You are wildly, insanely depressed.
Depressed? I'm the furthest thing from depressed. I mean, look at what I've accomplished. Do you see him? Do you think a depressed person could make this? No.
I don't know. It just sort of sparked my interest. And once I started putting cards together, it just seemed like a very interesting challenge. And then the fact that it played out even in a more extreme way than I expected just made it really sort of, maybe fun's not the right word, but engaging to keep tinkering with.
Well, why don't you tell the tale? I have my perspective on the games and drafts we've played, but I'm curious to hear your angle on let's go in chronological order. We'll start with some of the first playtesting we did.
The weird thing about this is obviously like if you're drafting against bots on Cube Cobra or another.
Wait, actually, time out. Sorry, real quick. Do we have to say why Guild Globe is broken now that we've sort of stipulated the rules thing? Guild Globe says 0 mana, draw a card, and add 2 mana of any 2 colors to your mana pool is what Guild Globe does in the context of this rules change.
That seems pretty good. So it's a half of a rainbow black lotus, 2/3 of a rainbow lotus that draws a card.
That seems and then Maze Mind Tome. Maze Mind Tome is just 4 mana to draw a card, and then you have an artifact in play to continue drawing cards from for free on the 2 following turns. So it's kind of like a free Ancestral Recall over 3 turns, which is really really good. And then Phyrexian Metamorph is basically just Porcelain Legionnaire, also free, we should say. You pay 2 life to cast it still, but you just play it for free. And then Metamorph only costs 1 mana, and I found that copying things in this environment is particularly important. I'm sorry, it's just before we got too deep in the story of the draft. I just wanted to make sure for anybody that was following along that we clarified why these cards are so weirdly ranked in our sort of pack ranking.
Do you know what I find myself mostly copying with Phyrexian Metamorph?
Is it Guild Globe?
It's Guild Globe.
I find myself copying quite a few Guild Globes with Metamorph as well. Anyway, you were talking about the sort of first playtest of the cube.
So, similar to the Arena Turbo Draft, which was against bots, the bots are not reevaluating the cards in this context. So you are just getting what would otherwise be pretty mediocre cards, in the Ikoria draft. This was the Blitz Leeches and other, 5-mana spells. In this case, it's Guild Globe and Prophetic Prism and Maze-Bind Tome and the actual eggs themselves, these which are similar to the Guild Globes but have a fixed 2 colors of mana. So your decks are just broken. You basically can play between 5 to 8 lands. Cycling, really importantly, is free because it costs 2. So you can just build these ridiculous decks where a lot of your spells are free, a lot of your deck just cycles for free, so you're effectively playing a 25 card deck, and then you have all this absurd mana ramp and card draw that you can build these really, really brutal fast decks. And that's been interesting.
Yeah, so our first playtest, we got all of the eggs between us. I don't think the bots took any of them, basically, because why would they? They would not prioritize them very highly. So we ended up with these decks that just... Every deck plays like a Storm deck when you're doing a 2-person draft with 6 bots at a table, because you get all of these mana-positive and card-positive spells, and then it's just like, all right, well, what do I want to do with it? And if you've ever seen, like LSV draft a Storm deck on Vintage Cube on MTGO, his whole point is that, it doesn't matter what win condition is. If I have all these ways to draw cards and generate mana, I will win with a ham sandwich. It does not matter. And that was kind of how these sort of first 2 games played out. Frankly, it was really, really fun. We did a couple of these drafts, and, I have a screenshot of my first deck here. So, my first deck from this cube has a total of... I did have a total of, 7 lands, but 2 of them had cycling, so really just 5 lands. I'd never played the lands that had cycling. They were just in there for their cycling ability. And, 15 free spells, and then 11 spells that cost 1 mana. Well, I guess 12 spells that cost 1 mana. 14 spells that cost 1 mana. I'm finding more in different, CMC columns here. And then just 2 4-drops, quote-unquote, which are 2 drops. So my deck is all free spells, 1 CMC spells, and, 2 CMC spells, very few of them. So they're just very, very low to the ground.
And if I remember correctly, how that usually went was you'd play an island, play 10 or 12 artifacts that draw you a card and cost nothing, and then cast an Arcbound Ravager and sacrifice your 12 Thopters and destroy me. Does that what you remember?
Yeah, this one was also, I think, shaped by Retrofitter Foundry specifically. Which,
right.
This particular deck, I did the Retrofitter Foundry with Metallic Mimic combo in 2 separate games. So Retrofitter Foundry, for those not familiar, I'll mention this card because I think it's just a great cube card that is not overpowered, but is very flexible and I think good in a lot of environments. This is an artifact that costs 1 mana to play. And I'm going to actually pull it up so I don't get any of these things wrong, because that's quite a few little numbers on it. I want to make sure I don't screw up. It is an artifact that's 1 mana to play. You can pay 3 mana anytime to untap Retrofitter Foundry. And then you can pay 2 and tap it to make a 1/1 servo. You can pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice a servo and make a 1/1 Thopter. Or you can just tap it to sacrifice a Thopter and make a 4/4 colorless construct token. And the way this plays out in most environments is that it just kind of gums up the board and it makes attacks very hard, because you can, if you keep a little bit of mana open, always make a token, sometimes make a token and untap and sacrifice that token, so you can basically, chump block, but then cash that token in to upgrade it. It just kind of grinds people out. And it's quite good against aggro, too, because making 1/1s is reasonable because they trade with a lot of aggro's threats. In this environment, Anthony, it just makes a 1/1 for free every single turn, and then untaps for only a single mana, which means you can just generate a ton of tokens and upgrade them as you see fit.
It's a very strong card.
So that was kind of how my first deck played out. And how did you feel? That was I think you and I, was that the first games you played with this environment, or did you play with somebody else before me?
I think that might have been the first one.
How did you feel after that sort of first round of us playtesting against the bots?
I felt turbocharged.
I mean, we talked a lot about how it was not really indicative of what the environment would be like with humans because of how much those cards were thrown off. So there's a lot of, something mentioned on the show before, which is something I keep thinking about, is how difficult it is to playtest and design cubes that are far away from the norm, right? Like the sort of commonly trod design territory. And this is obviously a whole new world of card evaluation. Like everything, you have to rethink everything, right? You can't just slot in, quote unquote good cards and have them be good. Instead, everything's worse than Guild Globe, and you have to kind of reset your head on everything. So playtesting is, I think, really important for cubes like this because it helps you actually understand the environment. And I think you and I both agree that it was really fun to play those decks, but that's not really indicative of anything about the environment. There's not really a whole lot to learn. I mean, we learned that like some cards were good and others maybe didn't do as much as we thought, but we couldn't really test the viability of a specific deck or anything like that because of how skewed our sort of pick orders and stuff were based on the bots.
Sure, I mean, unless you elect to just say that is one way to play the cube, and that's totally reasonable.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I think that's actually a very good point, that the cube can just be designed to be played against bots and, drafted in that sense, in which case this could be what it is. So then more playtesting happened at various degrees, but we eventually ended up doing a draft with 6 humans and still 2 bots. So we are sort of dramatically cutting back on that effect of the bots just passing, broken cards that the bots don't know are broken. And played those games out. How was your deck in that? You drafted like an aggro deck in that draft, right?
Yeah, it was mostly red aggro, but I had a couple black cards as well. Specifically, Duretti Ingenious Iconoclast. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the red-black one.
And overall, the games were pretty good. I mean, things go very fast. The games are sort of ending on turn 3 or 4, but we did have some interesting games that ended up going a little bit longer, and a lot of interaction within those games. So overall, I had a good time. I didn't do great, but winning isn't the only fun part of Magic.
I guess I should say, too, it does make it a lot more fun, though.
Yeah.
That is important to not forget. I guess it's important to note that, like, just to describe how broken the decks were from our, 6-bot draft, I have a screenshot I took here of the most broken turn 1 any of us had in this sort of playtesting round. And I ended turn 1 with... Let's just start with 12 cards in my library. So
right.
That's a good sign.
So
a lot of fun has happened.
Almost decked yourself. And otherwise,
turn 1
I
almost
say,
decked myself.
Besides that stipulation, this is a normal 360 card cube that you draft in a normal way.
Right.
And
yeah. No other
40
rules
card
modifications decks whatsoever. But what I have in play at the end of my first turn is a single tap island, and then Psy Maverick Thopterist, and then 15 1/1 Thopters, a Mirror Retriever, a Hangerback Walker on 2 counters, an Archaeo Mender, a Tribute Mage, an Arcbound Ravager, a Prophetic Prism, a Magnifying Glass, a Relic of Progenitus, an Ichor Wellspring, and in my hand is Force of Negation, Force of Will, Cloud Conceer, Midnight Clock, and Island. So,
and then I came back and won that game. Can you believe?
He did not, listener. So our first couple playtesting games were over largely on turn 1 or 2. It was very rare that we had much interaction. It was kind of like parallel solitaire. It was really fun, but it was fun because you got to do this kind of insane broken stuff, not because it was challenging decision making and putting you in situations where you have to make a tough evaluation and choose between 2 lines of potentially equal value. It was no, I'm going to do the broken thing every time. My experience with the second draft, so I was again, I had so much fun playtesting this with you, and then I came into the second draft and I was like, this is gonna be great. I'm really excited to draft this against more humans. This environment is so fast and weird and fun. And I drafted I think a pretty good deck. I say it's a green-white deck, but the deck is 95% colorless, as I think most of the good decks are. I had a bunch of free stuff going on, which was great. The main sort of engine in my deck was Tireless Tracker, which in this environment just says, draw a card and put a counter on it whenever you play a land, because you can activate the clue for free, obviously. And basically ways to get a bunch of landfall triggers and just kind of go off with Tireless Tracker whenever that gets in play, and then just draw my whole deck and do rude stuff. And the deck did fine. I went 1-1 and had good games in terms of them being relatively close for most of I had good games in the sense that they could have definitely gone my way. But I have to say, the playtesting with the sort of human decks was just orders of magnitude less fun than the 1-on-1 solitaire drafting we did, because I found that without my deck being totally broken, chances to win on turn 1, and instead these games were going to, turn 5 or 6 most of the time, I would dump my whole hand on the first turn and then just be sitting there drawing cards and hoping that my opening hand, which I dumped on the first turn, was better than my opponent's opening hand, which they dumped on the first turn. And we very quickly ran out of decisions to make, and instead we're just top decking and saw who top decked better or who had better cards, which was not what I expected to happen at all. I really did not think that the games would end up kind of dragging on, which a lot of them did. We had until later turns in the game, but they're really fast turns because we just didn't have anything to do. We were just kind of passing the turn back and forth and poking each other with flyers or whatever. But it really threw me for a loop how different the environment was in those 2 different contexts. It doesn't sound like it was that different for you.
It definitely wasn't as different. I think there was more removal and interaction in the games I was playing, and I didn't feel like I was playing necessarily with an empty hand all the time. I'm curious, though, do you think that next time you would draft it differently if we can ever get people to do this again? Like, would you value wraths or counterspells or other effects that would just sort of allow you to prolong the game and maybe take advantage of more quote-unquote expensive spells?
I would. In our one-on-one playing, I was 100% just trying to do the most broken thing, and I felt like I was always rewarded for doing the most broken thing. So I would take anything I could cast for free over anything I couldn't, basically, with rare exception. There is a sort of these cards that are like these really important build-around cards, I think, in the environment, that if you assume you're going to have a lot of these free cycling artifacts, some cards really go up in value. So stuff like Sai, for example, which turns what would otherwise be you just kind of cycling through your deck and not doing a whole lot into a giant army. Stuff like Paradoxical Outcome is huge. Wheel of Fortune is really big. Monastery Mentor.
Oh, yeah.
Those are the kinds of cards I would take over Guild Globe, for example. But other than that, like I was never going to take a board wipe or an interactive spell over, anything I could cast for free. I just wanted to kind of go as fast as possible and just do broken stuff. And that's the approach I came to the second draft with. And obviously because humans were taking the cards, they did not get nearly as many broken cards. So like I had Armillary Sphere, which is actually not neg at all. It's not actually as good as I hoped it was. I had Mind Stone, Chromatic Star. Chromatic Star is really the best card I had, probably. So I had a few, like, kind of powerful cards. But for the most part, I was, playing this kind of landfall deck, which worked okay. But I was really impressed with board wipes because, in regular Magic, I feel like you don't put board wipes in decks that have a bunch of creatures in them, with the exception maybe of being like, normal limited. Like you probably would still put a board wipe in a normal limited deck because the power level's low enough that you can just break the symmetry by not playing stuff and just kind of holding back and waiting until you get some value off that board wipe. Here, it's like the exact opposite, where you can play a bunch of creatures in a board wipe because if you're on the draw, you just wait a turn, maybe two, and your opponent has already dumped their entire hand, and then you can board wipe and then dump your hand immediately. Like, the fact that everything is so fast, you can just get max value out of a board wipe without having to wait at all because your opponent is like on turn one essentially overcommitted to the board. And maybe I should be playing differently too. Maybe, I shouldn't be trying to get my opponent dead on turn 2 or 3. I should be, kind of being more strategic about it. Because I did have one game where I turn 1 had 2 Tireless Trackers in play, and I was so excited to untap because I had Harrow and Search for Tomorrow in my hand. So I was going to draw like 50 cards and have 2 giant Tireless Trackers and have them dead in one shot. But on their turn 1, they played Damnation or whatever, and I was like, oh, I'm just dead now. Or they played, what'd they play? So some board wipe. And it just killed me because I had committed all my cards to the board, and I just couldn't do anything after that.
I did have at least one game like that was just sort of like, came down to a single interaction. We're just going to keep saying Guild Globe. Guild Globe, Guild Globe, Guild Globe.
I think I know what the frame
the
image art is going to be for this episode.
It wasn't a Guild Globe. It was Guild Globe number 2. It was a Terrarian, which my opponent countered on turn 1 with a Convolute, I think it was. So all these like broken 1-mana counter spells, and my game went from feeling like I couldn't possibly lose because I can cast 3 spells with my Terrarian on turn 2 and make a bunch of tokens with my Monastery Mentor. Turn 2, I have nothing. This hand is completely dysfunctional, and just got run over.
That was the other thing I found to be stifling and maybe enjoyed the sort of second draft a lot less, was that there still were these really powerful things present in the environment, obviously, right? Like, people could still just play Guild Globe on turn 1 and be up a card and up 2 mana. Like, it's almost like Guild Globe is like a double time walk almost. It draws you a card, and it, like, for that turn, and I mean, the land drops don't really matter. What matters is mana at any given turn, and you're essentially up 2 mana on the entire turn. So it's a really powerful card. And, like, I just felt like, oh, they happen to have their egg in their opening hand, and I didn't, and now I'm at a huge disadvantage. Whereas when we were both doing it, we both had a bunch of eggs, it was these, like, dueling, stupid, powerful decks, which at least felt somewhat fair. It was like, yeah, I mean, I do broken stuff, he does broken stuff, it's all to be expected. And here it felt a lot more tilting when my opponent just happened to have a broken card and I didn't. And it was like, darn, I just lose now because I only played 3 spells on turn 1 instead of 8.
I'd really love to see how sort of the metagame of this would develop, because sure, you can do a lot of broken stuff very quickly, and I totally understand that, like, when it's in lower concentration, it feels higher variance because you just either have it or you don't.
Right.
But at the same time, like, if you play your Monastery Mentor on turn 1 and your opponent has a Dismember or a Pyrokinesis, or they're able to cast a Wrath next turn, that is still a completely effective way to sort of counter that.
Right, yeah. That was the other thing, is that, removal was never really no interaction was really relevant in much of our playtesting games when we were doing it one-on-one.
Right.
But here, I did have my tile trackers removed frequently, and I had like I said, a board wipe totally change the outcome of a game and make me feel like I couldn't win, and I didn't. So yeah, I felt like the removal was much more relevant here too, because you weren't going so fast that... Removal is terrible if your opponent's going to win on turn 1 on the play, right? I mean, like, there's some you can cast for free, I guess.
Which is possible.
You can pyrokinesis, I suppose, but, you know, it looks really bad. Like, it does not help in that sort of turn 1 I described to then have me pass the turn and you say, now I'll dismember your, Psy. It's like, great, I got 15 Thopters, so I'm okay with you killing Psy. So in that context, that was how I was evaluating the removal, was in the context of, like, we were doing all this broken stuff, and it just couldn't keep up. Here it felt very relevant because there are often these, like, linchpin cards that the entire game revolves around.
Yeah, for sure.
I did discover the hard way that, Ronus's activated ability can be redirected to your opponent's spell skite, which is really punishing.
Oh, no.
That was how I was going to win that game, too, because Ronus is very good in this environment, but alas, I made my opponent's spell skite very big. It was not good.
Very cool. You love to see it.
Tell me more about, like, how you're processing this environment and the sort of playtesting we've done and what you think about it. Are you going to continue to work on this? Like, where are you at with this?
I have no plans. This is just a project. Who knows? Tomorrow I'll design a new cube. Basically, the process has been, I started with that concept of, let's sort of build this turbo powered up environment. People love to play Moxen and other very powerful cards. Like, we can have that same experience even if we're not, like, actually buying these very expensive cards, just by tweaking the rules and saying Guild Globe is now insane. So I took that idea, but then also looked at how the Arena Ikoria turbo draft went, and it was really critical that you were just drafting against bots, so you were able to play just those dozen cards that were actually relevant, that were, like, way overpowered for that context, and tried to make it so that we had still a huge diversity of different cards, but all of them were equally broken by this change in the rules.
Right, because that was one of the things we talked about, was that, we talked about how that turbo draft on Arena was riding on the wrong track, right? Like, now all of a sudden this set was not designed to be played in this insane way, obviously, so, like, 3/4 of the cards are just terrible. Like, the sort of power levels all over the board, or all over the place. So here, like, this is 360 cards that are all kind of broken in half with this new rules change.
Yeah. So the other thing I did is, obviously, I settled on 2 rather than 5. I feel like at 5 mana, you were just sort of cutting out way too many cards, like trying to build a cube that was interesting around that would just have a lot less flexibility. But 2 is still a pretty chunky discount, so saying, like, your 3-drops are now your 1-drops, I think gives you a very different feel from a normal cube, but also still gives you a lot of choice in terms of what cards you can include reasonably. And then I also extended that to abilities as well, just because I felt like that added some interesting space. And again, like, the great thing about cube design is if something is broken, you can just exclude it. So a lot of cards like Basalt Monolith or Prismite, way OP Prismite.
Prismite's broken.
We can just exclude those. And the obvious thing that I started with, actually, this was really sort of interesting way that sort of the thought process about this changed, is I was talking about this with a couple people, and they were like, oh, well, that's so interesting. If you're saying everything is a discount, that means you can just play, like, huge stuff, because, like, the game just starts on turn 2 or turn 3, effectively, right? And the reality is, even though that feels very intuitive, the exact opposite is true. When you are saying everything costs 2 less, the discount of 2 on a 3-mana spell versus 2 on a 6-mana spell is tremendous. Like,
right.
The 3-mana spell becomes broken because you're cutting its cost in half, whereas the 6-mana spell, you're only losing a third of its cost. So the environment is incredibly, incredibly skewed towards just playing basically 3-drops or free spells altogether.
Yeah, anything that is like 4 CMC or above has to really earn its slot. Most of the things above that sort of point have cycling, and they're rarely played anyway.
And I was even shocked, so like I tried to skew the cube as low as possible, make sure that, all the 4-drops that were in there were actually a sort of step above and were things that you really wanted to reach for. But I was shocked by playing the games how much that was even more true than I even would have expected. And you're like looking at your 5-drop and you're like, well, my opponent just cast 3 spells on turn 1 and I'm hoping to cast this 2 turns from now. This feels terrible. So yeah, since that I've just been continuing to sort of push the converted mana cost of spells as far down as I possibly can, with the exception of cards that really can take you back from behind. So like spending 2 mana for a Wrath is still very effective, I think, in this context.
Yeah, exactly. The comeback cards, I think, make sense. But, I mean, when you put it in that context, like, it's your turn too. Do you want to put 2 3 CMC permanents into play or 1 4 CMC permanent into play? And it's like, you're always going to take 2 3 CMC permanents, right? Just
I mean, you're effectively doubling the discount you get because you got the discount on 2 cards rather than just on 1.
Right. There's that. And also just that, the way that cards are developed, like, there's actually not a huge difference between 3 and 4 CMC cards, right? Like, as you go up, and that difference gets smaller and smaller and smaller with every step because, the difference between a 7-drop and an 8-drop is completely negligible, like pretty much at the end of the day, because, it's so much mana that it's not going to make a huge difference to the decks that are playing those cards. I mean, I guess I chose a bad example because Tron produces exactly 7 mana and no more, but you get the sort of point, I guess.
If we sort of assume that if we simplify it and assume it's sort of linear, a 4-drop is 33% more powerful than a 3-drop. But when we change that to, now your 1-drops or your 2-drops are only 33% more than powerful than your 1-drops, that doesn't hold up anymore. Now your 2-drops are just abysmal.
Right.
So there are definitely a lot of cards that are broken. Obviously, we talked about all the eggs, so Guild Globe. Prophetic Prism is just a Moxen that draws a card. The Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star. These are all great and a lot of fun. They're fun to cast. There's also a ton of artifact cantrips what are some good examples? The Springjaw Trap, Mazevine Tome, I guess, falls in this category. Relic of Genis. All these things just become free. And sort of this was the thing that kind of sparked some joy, is this idea of, hey, it's going to be a fast format. Like, let's just jam a lot of these free things that may only have minimal effects in the game, but just allow you to sort of either build small synergies around them or just have this experience of casting a ton of spells very quickly. Cycling obviously becomes very broken.
I also, for what it's worth, I had the experience of, like, I put cycling spells in my deck and I expected only to cycle them, but I won games with Migratory Route.
Right.
Because it's like, obviously, like, I'm mostly going to cycle it, but at a certain point, you dig through your deck and you start running out of threats because your opponents remove stuff, and you're like, you know what? 4/1/1 bird sounds really good right now, so I'm actually going to cast Migratory Route instead of cycling it for free.
The modality, like, this is another subject that we talk about a lot, that just modality is extremely powerful, and when one of the modes is cycling 0, that is a pretty broken Magic card.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that both Gitaxian Probe has been banned in many formats. Mishra's Bauble has proved to be very playable at competitive levels of Magic, so cycling 0 does not need anything stapled onto it to be good, right? It's just kind of good as a sort of baseline, and then any other modes on top of it are total gravy.
So the other thing that I thought was really interesting when trying to design this cube is it was honestly very challenging, for the reason that I felt like I just didn't have any specific guideline. So I had this sort of mechanical structure where I wanted to create an interesting environment with this twist on the rules, but I had no idea where to start with that. It was just like, okay, I know that 3 CMC spells or, 2-mana artifacts are going to be extremely powerful, but other than that, like, where do I start looking? Whereas normally if you're designing either, a legacy or a pauper or any kind of cube, often you'll look at existing precedent, you'll look at just like what are the most powerful cards you can play in that context. Or you might be designing a cube where you're saying, I want to build around specific mechanical things, and I want to have, my Aristocrats deck, and I want to have my Goblins deck, or whatever the other archetypes you're trying to build around are. And those sort of give you touchstones of where to start going. And I felt a little bit sort of overwhelmed is maybe a little bit strong, but just like there wasn't a lot to go on.
Right.
So where I ended up trying to explore is doing a bunch of searches on everyone's favorite Magic the Gathering database, Scryfall, for what are the cards that are most affected in interesting ways by this mechanical change. So it wasn't about then saying like, okay, well, we'll make an Enchantress's deck in this new context. I really wanted to try and draw out cards that are recontextualized and make you think about those cards in a new way that sort of creates these interesting moments of discovery, like, oh my god, this Pentad Prism, that's the wrong one. Chromatic Star works in a different way now. So I did a lot of searches for artifacts or other colorless cards that cost 2, cards that cost 2 and a single devotion, like a single red, single blue, and also activated abilities that follow those same rules, and just trying to find interesting spaces where there are cards that behave in a new way. So one of the other interesting spaces that I ended up trying to develop is with cards like Jade Mage and Mobilization that effectively now have a single colored mana pip devotion to make 1/1 tokens. So whereas we've talked about like a 5 mana spell is pretty bad, even in a deck that can cast Harrow and ramp themselves on turn 1, it's still just a lot of risk to put in your deck, especially when a lot of the like ramp targets generate value over multiple turns, which just doesn't work that well when the games are fast. But cards like Jade Mage and Mobilization just let you use as much mana as you can possibly generate. They're like the perfect scalable threat, I think, for this environment.
Yeah, mana sinks are great here because of the weird amounts of mana. First of all, the extremely large amounts of mana relative to the turn of the game it's on, but also you're not always in control of the amount of mana you're generating because you are cracking these eggs and you just end up with, weird mana floating around. And so having a place to dump that, I think, is very valuable. I had multiple turns that were great turns, but I also ended with like 3 unspent mana because I just couldn't do anything else with the cards I had drawn. And so having those mana sinks, I think, is great.
And then from that point, it became, and especially after a little bit of initial playtesting, it became a lot easier once there was a rough list to sort of figure out, like, well, what's working here, what's not working here. So trying to play into cards like Sai and Monastery Mentor that were already sort of being triggered repeatedly by the things that were optimal, that people just wanted to do as much as possible.
Oh, Sai, are you triggered? Triggering the libs. It's like Sai and Monastery Mentor. Monastery Mentor is a snowflake. Anyway, how were you playing into those again?
Just trying to emphasize, again, like, these were kind of the fun things. How do we make sure those work? And also, how do we add ways to counter the strategies that are kind of broken? So adding in, like, the free counter spells, like Force of Will and Force of Negation, what is effectively a free removal spell in Dismember, and Pyrokinesis, things like that. And then also pushing some of the, like, wraths in different forms, like our various red sweepers and black sweepers, which, again, like, all sorts of things change in such bizarre ways. Like Extinction Event, which you choose odd or even and destroy all creatures of that choice, CMC, is usually, I think, sort of middling, but because of this, like, bizarre way that so much is shifted toward 3 CMC spells, I think it actually becomes quite good here. Or tokens, yeah. A card like, what's our favorite card? I always mix it up. Not Carrion Feeder. The carrier that gives everything -1/-1 of a certain creature type.
Oh, Plague Engineer.
Plague Engineer. There he is. I think this is another card that ends up becoming quite strong.
Well, that card is quite strong. I will have to push back on a little bit.
I agree. I think it is criminally underrated, and I think it is incredible here.
Yeah, it's quite good. I have to ask, Anthony, when we finished our draft with 6 humans instead of 2 humans, where we got to experience the environment a little more, and I mentioned that a lot of my games were just kind of very boring because I dumped my hand, the opponent dumped their hand, and then we just kind of stared at each other in top deck for a while. I have to say I had one realization, which I think is a very concise way to describe why that was not a fun draft experience, which is just that playing Magic with no hand is not fun, and that was what this environment was kind of pushing me to do. The games weren't over immediately, but they were effectively over, and then we just got to play out this system of like who drew the better cards at that point and sort of play these things out. But I mentioned that it was way less fun than I thought, which I did not mean as a criticism of the environment, because I viewed this as kind of like an experiment, right? Like you were kind of setting out to see like what happens if we do this and what will we learn.
I do not want to say this is a better or more correct way to play Magic. As you know, my normal cube is much, much lower powered, and that is a choice.
And part of the experiment is like, is this fun? And the sort of 1v1 drafts were really fun, and I really did not have fun, frankly, with the 6-person draft. And you seem to take some delight in that, and I was wondering why that was.
Did I?
Well, you said, you seemed to imply that you had sort of, and maybe in some way demonstrated that, like, doing broken stuff is not as fun as people think it might be. Like, I oftentimes feel like there's a slight undercurrent to your sort of opinion that, like, too many people like doing broken stuff in Magic and don't appreciate doing fair stuff. Is that fair to say?
You want me to come out and be the bad guy, be the heel?
That's how we get clicks and listeners, Anthony. You have to, like, we want people to be retweeting this saying, go listen to this guy, he's a jerk and idiot, doesn't understand anything about Magic.
All right, I'll be the jerk. I mean, obviously there's a tremendous amount of appeal to playing broken stuff. And if you're just used to doing, like, standard drafts and you're like, I play my creature, I attack, I block, great. And then when you move that experience to saying, like, look what vintage looks like, it feels insane and powerful and such a, like, tremendous novel experience. But I think if you actually look at how a vintage cube draft plays out, it's extremely high variance. And there's this sort of, like, correlation between serious play and consistency in play, which,
or like a high power level.
And a high power level. Like, these things sort of, like, get tied together in people's minds for good reason, because, like, the better players can build more consistent decks, they value consistency. But I think especially in a vintage cube draft, that isn't actually why a vintage cube draft is fun. Like, the variance is really important, and the fact that you can just, like, play a Black Lotus and a Dark Ritual and then storm off on turn 1 is like a powerful and novel experience. But I think it is really important to be reflective on the fact that that is a high variance experience and is not necessarily more skill testing in the way that you're like, in the sense that you're not necessarily assessing novel board states and trying to figure out the best lines of play. So that's kind of like my case for why I love playing at a lower power level, because I think all of that complexity is there. It's just a little bit slower and honestly less variable than playing a Black Lotus for sure.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Vintage Cube is definitely very high variance. When you're drafting and some of the cards are Black Lotus and some of the cards are like, I don't know, a Johnny Greathearted or whatever. Like, there's just going to be a huge disparity in certain opening hands are just going to be unbeatable, which I think is, like, Vintage Powered Cube is like it's like a Timmy format, which is totally fine. And you can spike a Timmy format all day if you want. That's, that's what CEDH is. There's a whole group of people that are spiking a Timmy format. But yeah, there's something very fundamentally just visceral about I want to play these powerful cards. It's not necessarily about, the most competitive gameplay where the tables are as even as possible. And I have to say, when I first got deeper and deeper into Magic, and you and I have not played a ton of Constructed, but I have dabbled in a couple of things. I have to say, I first assumed that obviously, as the card pool gets bigger and the decks get, quote unquote, more powerful, then all the games must just be over really quickly, right? Like, it's really fast, everyone's just doing broken combos and stuff. And if you go all the way to Vintage, certainly Vintage is kind of plays like that. But the distinction between Legacy and Modern is interesting to me, because Modern is a much faster format than Legacy. This has been, proven mathematically. I think Frank Carson has written an article about the average numbers of turns in these games based on databases of gameplay. And Modern is just much faster than Legacy because of the sort of nature of the interaction in Legacy, mostly Force of Will and stuff. There's a lot of things you can do in Modern, or at least could do maybe before Force of Negation was printed, that you could never viably pull off in a Legacy environment. So Legacy ended up being grindy compared to Modern sort of fast decks, which I don't know. It was helpful for me to learn that power level is not really correlated or sort of causally related to anything in Magic. You can have a high power level and have the games be very slow. You can have a high power level and have the games be really fast. These are all independent variables that are sometimes related to each other, but not always. And, here it's these decks are obviously you can imagine sitting down across the table from somebody and you're playing one of these decks from your cube with your rule stipulation, and they're playing some normal Magic, and you're just going to completely leave them in the dust. These decks are really, really powerful in that regard. But we also had games that were ending on turn 15 because we both just dumped our hands and it was kind of a board stall, and then we just stared at each other and took turns top decking free artifacts that did nothing. Because, Guild Globe is great, and it's just a really good draw with too, because you get to, draw another card, obviously. Playing a free Armillary Sphere on turn 4 doesn't feel that great anymore, because you're well, what am I even doing here? So, yeah, I don't know. It's just the power level is one of the most difficult to pin down aspects of an environment, and it's also not necessarily related to anything else. You can have a fast environment that is any power level and vice versa.
And I've been trying to push it. Obviously, I've only been working on this for a week and a half, but I've put a fair amount of time into it. And I've been trying to push that early interaction as much as possible, so adding the free removal spells and effective cheap board wipes in order to try and push for a more interactive and slightly longer environment. Obviously, sort of the turbo feel of it is still a lot of fun, and keeping the format fast, I think, is valuable. But aside from that, is there anything else you would recommend in trying to make it less painful than the experience that you had?
I don't know. I mean, I think partially it was the deck I drafted, because I did have a lot of kind of air in my deck that only really works if it's in the service of doing something broken, and once they remove your tireless tracker or something, then you're just kind of left with the air, and it doesn't feel great. I think the deck was okay, but I would draft very differently now than I did, with my expectations going into that draft. But the only thing that I would maybe consider is you have included some degree of these broken artifacts, but there's a lot of broken ones you haven't included for whatever reason. The signets aren't here, for example. Those are just, 0 mana, make 2 mana, which is obviously very good. It's a, much better Mox. So I think the density of those effects has a very big effect on the environment. And I think that's a conscious decision you make as a designer of how many of these effects do I want to include? And in some ways, I found the much higher density when we were drafting against bots more fun, because it was that much more pushed to its insane levels, and it felt like a lot of things were more abusable than were abusable sort of at the sort of lower power level. Maybe there's too many, you should sort of shave down on it a little bit, because it is very sort of high variance when your opponent draws their Guild Globe and you don't. But yeah, I think that's really the only thing I would tweak. The other thing I'll say is I don't think the fixing lands are doing anything here. I don't even think about these decks in terms of colors, really. Like, you end up playing only a couple colors, really. But with all the sort of basic land cycling and, you know, stuff like that, you can play extra lands in your deck that you can find very easily. Sadie's having some opinions about the cube as well. She's just thinking about the cube. She was like, you know, play Go Globe, is what she says.
God, people are going to be so tired of hearing that.
So yeah, I think those are the two things I would say. I would take fixing lands very low here, and I think the most important knob for you to like tweak is just how many broken artifacts do people get on average.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely agree on the fixing. It ended up being like bizarrely underpowered. It's so strange to just like look at a pack and see like, or even more so to be looking at the deck that you drafted and say, well, I have like a Wayfarer's Bubble and a Armillary Sphere. I only want to play 7 lands. I actually can't play these 2 fetches. I just need enough basics to make these cards work. And there are a couple things that really enable that. First of all, there's a bunch of cards with basic land cycling, which is just extremely powerful. Like 2 mana, get a basic land. It's just free fixing. Like, it is better than a fetch land. Again, if you want to play more powerful Magic than you've ever played before, Migratory Route for free is an excellent card.
You don't have to buy Scalding Tarns or Black Lotuses. You could just make up rules, print your own emblems, and then all your guild globes are broken.
And then in addition to that, we have this cycle of cards, including Jehessen Zombies, that have 2 named land cycling. So this one has Island Cycling and Swamp Cycling, and those let you get the the shock lands. So I have already cut down tremendously on the lands. I think I cut out all of the cycles except for... There's still 2 of each shock land and the cycling lands, because that, again, still sort of plays into the theme. And then a couple things that are just kind of broken, like Cave of Temptation. But yeah, I definitely agree. I was really surprised to find how much I just didn't need to prioritize and didn't want to prioritize fixing.
And the shock lands might still be worth it, but if I have 3 cards with basic land cycling in a deck that draws so many of its cards, I feel like I really only need 1 basic to like splash a few cards off of it, which is, you know, not unreasonable. And at that point, it's like, you know, would I get a slight upgrade if I had a shock land that was also the other color I was playing? Maybe, but it's a very minimal thing. I did really like the interaction with the cards that had land cycling of types that sort of, it was that cycle from Shards of Alara, I think, that you were referencing, paired with the bicycle lands that also had cycling, because very often I will say that like you need to run enough lands to hit your first 2 or 3 land drops, but really beyond that you don't need any more mana, is my experience. Even in the sort of, you know, 6 human draft we did, like that deck is only playing 9 lands and the other deck was playing 7 or whatever, and I would have honestly played a couple fewer. I sided out of some lands in later games because, you know, it's nice to have those basic land cyclers in there, but like oftentimes you just actually want more action. And so being able to cycle into a land that then cycles for real cards all for free was really nice option to have, I felt. I really liked that sort of interaction.
How awful would this cube be to play in paper?
Just because of all the shuffling and like cards moving around all the zones. It would be different. How much shuffling is there actually? I mean, there's a lot of drawing cards, but it's like, I guess all the cycling, like basic land cycling and stuff is the same as fetches, but there's not that many more things with basic land cycling here than there are fetch lands in a normal cube, right?
Yeah, that's probably fair.
I think it'd be fine. I mean, making the cube in paper would be the annoying part, and it wouldn't be worth it, I don't think, because I'm not sure how much replayability this has in its current incarnation, just because it is such a novel experience. But I learned a couple things from this environment. I mean, obviously it's always, I think, a welcome challenge to evaluate cards in a totally new context, because in some ways that's all of Magic, right? Like every game state is a new context, and if you get too like stuck in this like way of thinking about the cards that like, this is a good effect, this is a bad effect, this is powerful, this is not powerful, then you can very easily lead yourself astray in specific situations where actually what would otherwise be a non-optimal play becomes the right play. So I always am appreciative of any, you know, context to evaluate cards anew. But I also felt like I learned, I had an interesting experience with regards to like tempo here, which was that this format is largely dominated by tempo, because you've essentially said tempo is OP. Like, just go and do everything as fast as you want, and you know, you can use as much tempo as you want at any given time. I multiple times ran into a situation of being like, I have totally abused tempo to like the maximum effect. And I actually think what happens is, like in our bot drafts, because all the free cards were coming to us so readily, that I think the cards I took more highly there that were just any like, you know, good 2-for-1. And by 2, I mean really 2 cards, like not just stuff like Trinket Mage, which goes and finds Guild Globe, which is good and all. But,
Trinket Mage doesn't find Guild Globe.
Sorry, Trinket Mage goes and finds Chromatic Star or Chromatic Sphere. That's a good point. Thank you for correcting me. Otherwise, we're going to get tweets and emails. That was still good, but what I really liked was stuff that essentially drew 2 cards, right? Because then I was taking all that tempo and converting it into value. And so, like, Tezzeret's Gambit was a card I suggested, which played out as about as broken as I expected it to, because it's 1 mana, draw 2, which is fabulous. I really liked evoking Muldrifter in this environment. Again, another 1 mana, draw 2. And when you're just drawing 2 cards and most of your cards are free to cast, it's really powerful. So I think what happened here is that, like, this format is dominated by tempo, but because of that, value is a much scarcer resource and, needs to be prioritized. It's kind of like the opposite of if you had a cube that, just had the Moxen in it. The Moxen are really important in a regular powered cube because nobody else gets that insane tempo advantage, right? Of just playing 2 lands in the first turn because one happened to be a Mox. And here, a lot of people get to do that, but not everybody gets a paradoxical outcome or a wheel effect or a sort of big card draw spell that's free to cast. And so those things become like the sought after resources. And I had games where I just kind of like played a bunch of spells and did nothing, right? Like I cast a bunch of stuff and I was left with like some dinky creatures in play that was not that impressive. And my opponent was able to beat me with a relatively fewer spells, which felt like, tempo can lose sometimes too.
Yeah, I think I would definitely, if we draft this again, look to get some more value. One of the cards that I felt like I got the most value out of actually was an all-time favorite of mine, Archfiend of Ifnir, which I might have put into every single cube I've ever designed. Somehow it just feels like very scalable, and you can like put it in context where the amount of like discard sort of lets you tune it. In this context, it itself has cycling, and I've never wanted to cycle this card before, but just being a free 3-drop basically in this context that I can just cycle if it doesn't work, and then every once in a while maybe I'll try and buy it back and then cycle a bunch of other cards to get that value I need. It was a ton of fun.
I was thinking about that card specifically in the shower this morning because I was so
new segment, Andy's shower time.
Put in a shower sound effect right here. I was thinking about that card because I love cycling so much and I love modal cards so much. And I really think that if that card was cycling 1, for example, it would be just so incredible. Like, I would love to play that in my cube. And even though my cube is, I think, too powerful for Archfiend currently, because cycling 2 is, twice as much, it's a lot more. Even if it was just cycling for a black, I think it would be, really, really messed up. And I kind of look at that card and I'm like, man, I wish you'd gotten the Curator of Mysteries treatment and just been cycling 1 instead, because you're so close. And I do really like the card. It's very cool how it turns one resource into another and can serve as both a threat and also a stabilizing force, which not a lot of cards can claim that.
It's a good card.
Shower over. Creak, 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 creak. Turn the knobs
sorry, I didn't
back.
mean to say anything while you're in the shower.
Anthony, why are you in the shower with me? What the heck's going on?
Why are you holding all these magic cards in the shower?
I wanted to talk about, so you specifically said that you originally approached this environment thinking that cards like Spined Thopter specifically, which you mentioned by name, would go in every deck, but after playing it a little bit, you no longer felt that way. I still think Spined Thopter goes in every deck, so where are we not seeing eye to eye here?
To me, it just felt like there were so many games where if your opponent does something broken, and you're sort of trying to do your own broken combo, but one of the cards in your hand is a free 2-power flyer, it just isn't contributing to your strategy and isn't actually able to impact your opponent's strategy in an effective way. So yeah, after some drafting, I feel like I really only want those free spells, with some exceptions. I think I really only want those free creatures in like a dedicated aggressive deck where my goal is to literally dump my whole hand of free creatures on turn 1 and try and close out the game right away. And if I'm trying to draft a deck with a different strategy, I'd rather have just like a free cycler to actually dig for the cards that impact my gameplay, my strategy, than just a cheap creature, which I think is, to me, that's like very encouraging that even in this bizarre, strange environment, there actually are like, it is important to try and draft a deck that has a coherent strategy, and there are different archetypes.
Yeah, I think I agree that a free cycler is better than Spine Thopter. I guess what I'm looking at is like most things that cost 3, I think I would still rather have the Thopter over. Like I can't imagine drafting so many free cyclers and other free spells that are better than Spine Thopter that it would not make the cut in my deck. Whereas maybe and maybe that's something I have to update, my evaluations for. Because like I said, I think I prioritized those things a little too highly and ended up with some error in some games where I just, like you said, had a bunch of like dinky little dudes and didn't really do much. Like Farfinder was a card that really underperformed for me, which kind of bummed me out. It's a 1-mana 1/1 that, you know, now puts a land in your hand with Vigilance, which should be fine because it only costs 1 mana, but for all the reasons you talked about, like if you have so many cards that go and get lands, then you have to, like, you know, you run out of lands to get, and even then, like, what's a 1/1 doing for you? Like, and why am I going to pay 1 mana to go get a land? The 1/1 does nothing for me in this environment, so like really I've just taxed my land, which could have just been another land or something else, because like I'm not going to get much value out of that body.
Right. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have a card like Magnifying Glass, which is 3 mana, taps for colorless, but you can also pay 4 to investigate. So in normal Magic, that would be 6 mana to draw a card. Here it's 2 mana to draw a card, which feels good. And because it effectively costs 1 and taps for colorless, it sort of costs 0. But again, because like the average converted mana cost that you want to put into your deck is so compressed, so many of your spells end up costing like exactly a red. It's actually a huge liability to put this card, which looks like it's sort of free, into a deck, because that colorless mana just won't allow you to actually cast many of your spells. So I think the spell is Magnifying Glass is still pretty good, but it really only fits in like some kind of control deck where it's actually going to take advantage of the fact that it can draw cards late.
Yeah, the colored mana sources ended up being like basically the most important thing. Like I didn't care about ramping for colorless mana at all because I had so much of it for free. Even though there were still, you know, 4 and 5 drops or whatever I did want to cast eventually. There weren't that many of them, and it just, all I cared about was getting like the right number of colored mana sources. I know you ended up cutting Seething Song, but I still think that card is so interesting here because it's obviously quite strong because it takes you from 1 mana to 5 mana, but more importantly, it gives you 5 red mana, which I think I wish there were other cards that converted colorless mana into colored mana that weren't the sort of eggs, which are totally broken, because I feel like the Seething Song, what that would potentially allow for is like turn 1, Mountain, Seething Song, 5 3-drops, right? Because if all your 3-drops were 2 in a red, you could just play Hammer Garrison, Rabble Master, Ironcrag Pyromancer, Thopter Engineer, like all on turn 1, which would be pretty nuts.
And that, I think, is still possible with some of these cards, but that's a good point that, like, even though these eggs are totally broken, they're a little bit less broken than I thought they would be. Still totally broken. But
I guess we should be a little careful with broken. Like, some things were deemed actually broken. Like, Prismite just makes infinite mana of all the colors. That is, like, broken in the way in which this environment is broken. The eggs are, I think, fundamental to how the environment works. They would be broken as they're played in any other environment. Here, they're kind of like a defining feature.
Right. But yeah,
so they weren't as powerful as you expected, specifically because you were kind of stuck with whatever color they produced for the most part.
Right. So often they just end up cycling. Maybe you can only use one of the 2 colored mana that it makes because you don't happen to have a blue and a white spell in your hand at the right time.
Right. And there's not that much use for colored mana because of the way you draft again. You're just trying to get as much out of that discount as you possibly can.
Similar related to that, I was a little bit disappointed to do this, but I felt like it was right. There were a bunch of interesting lands that I ended up getting cut that had basically free abilities because they just cost 2. But because they generated colorless mana, just became basically unplayable. One of the ones that is still in there that I think is still quite good is Buried Ruin, which taps for a colorless, but also you can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice it to get an artifact back from your graveyard to your hand, which I think is interesting just to think of this as a free spell that you can play on turn 3. And I think that works. Strong.
You know, I'm not sure if you're planning on continuing to work at this at all, but I might consider... You have Explore in here, correct?
Yes.
Have you considered stuff like Summer's Bloom?
Ooh, I hadn't.
So stuff like that might actually be relevant. I found like I had a deck that cared about landfall with a couple cards, and I had just too much searching for lands in my deck. I had this like frustrating pattern where I always had not enough lands when I needed lands, but then as soon as I, went to cast Harrow because I had my Tireless Tracker in play, there were no more lands left to find. And I was like, cool, great. I just always have the wrong amount of lands for whatever moment it is. So I wonder if some of those like land tutoring cards could actually be replaced with just, you can play additional lands. And there are more cards that have that text on it. I know Oracle is still in this cube, correct?
Yeah, Oracle, and also I believe Azusa is here. I think those actually are much worse than I had initially expected, just because you are able to play such a low land count.
Yeah, I kind of agree, but yeah. They're just like, because they're competing with some really messed up stuff at 3 mana and 4 mana respectively, and neither of them win you the game, right? They're just value plays. So maybe it doesn't make sense. This is a little live thought. Did you look at Girapur Orrery?
Is that the card that lets everybody draw extra cards and play extra lands? If you have nothing in your hand, you draw 3 cards?
Yeah, so it says each player can play additional land each turn, and then the card draw clause is at the beginning of each player's upkeep. If that player has no cards in hand, they draw 3 cards. Is that just too symmetrical, I guess?
It's symmetrical, but I think it's breakable. I mean, building around symmetrical effects is one of the most fun things to do in Magic.
I love symmetrical effects like that, but I feel like here, like everyone's going to almost inherently be building around the symmetrical effect of try and dump your hand. Like,
sure.
It's very likely your opponent's deck will also be pretty well aligned for that. Maybe that suggestion makes no sense. Well, I had fun playing this weird cube you designed, Anthony. It was a very interesting experience, and I feel like I learned, like I said, I appreciate any opportunity to evaluate cards in a new context. And I know it's no small task to put together a cube like this, so I appreciate you doing it so we could do some experiments.
I'm glad it was some kind of fun. But now we have to ask the real hard question. Does this cube pass the bag of holding test?
This is the most important test to ask of any cube, so I'm glad we're going to end the show with it. I think bag of holding is good here.
Just to clarify, it costs 1, aka 0. You can pay 2 and tap it to loot, draw a card, discard a card, and
AKA
whenever
you
you
pay
discard
0.
a card, whether it's from the bag or any other effect, you just put it in the bag, and then later you can pay 4, aka 2, and get back all those cards. So if your deck is full of cycling cards that you're cycling for free, it can basically just reload your hand for 2 mana.
I think yes. I think it is good, and it gets there.
Yes.
Largely because it's just totally free. I still think it's worse than like Maze Mind's Tome, for example, which is a similar card, but just gives you raw card draw without the option to like buy back the discarded cards. I still think that mode is a little cute, but being a free looter is just very good, and I think I would play it in any deck pretty much.
Wow. I've done it. I can quit cube designing.
It passes the bag of holding test, the number one most important test for all things to pass. That does it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in and listening, and thank DJ James Nasty for all of our music. Check him out online if you want to see more, if you want to listen to more cool music. And Anthony, thank you for talking about Magic with me.
I always love to talk about Magic.